Hello cruel world, my name is Dr. Sohom. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living, so that you don't have to. Ted Kaczynski, aka the Unabomber, killed 3 individuals and wounded 23 over almost 2 decades as a one-man terrorist. He was a child genius with an IQ of 167, and he entered Harvard University at 16 years old. Some forensic psychiatrists believe that he had paranoid schizophrenia, but some didn't. In this video, I will tell you what I think. So first, a bit of background about his crimes. Then I'll give you my psychoanalysis. So what were the Unabomber's crimes? The bombings started in 1978 and they carried on till 1995. Most of Kaczynski's victims were either academics or they were businessmen connected to the field of computer or technology. And he would made hand-delivered sophisticated bombs. He made about 16 of them altogether. The very first was directed to a professor of materials engineering called Buckley Christ, and it was left in the lot of a University of Chicago parking lot with the victim's return address, and so it was sent back to the victim. And then Christ found it, thought it was a little bit suspicious, gave it to the police opened it, and it exploded, causing only minor injuries. The second bomb was sent a year later to another university, and it was concealed inside a cigar box which was just left on a table, and again it caused minor injuries, and that was to a student who opened it. It's like my mama always said, never leave cigar boxes unattended, and I thought she was just kidding. Kaczynski even made a homemade pipe bomb which got onto the cargo hold of an American Airlines flight in 1979, although it actually failed to explode. So to give you an example of one of his more severe efforts, there was a multinational public relations and communications firm named Brunson Marsteller, and it had an executive named Thomas Mosser. So in 1994, he was killed after opening a nail bomb that was sent by Kaczynski to his home address, which was in New Jersey. Kaczynski wrote to the New York Times and said that he'd send it because of Mosser's work, which included repairing the public image of Exxon after the infamous oil spill which occurred in Alaska in March 1989, where an oil tanker struck a reef, bleeding out more than 10 million gallons of crude oil. In 1995, after he had done decades of bombing, he was known as the Unabomber, which is short for the University and Airline Bomber. Kaczynski made a manifesto and he demanded that this would be punished or the bombings would continue. The New York Times actually did this. They actually published it, and it was like this lengthy and rambling, ranting, raging rant against technology culture. As I will outline later in this video, the form as well as the content of this manifesto could possibly indicate schizophrenia. Somewhat ironically, his own brother recognized the style and the content of the comments of the manifesto, and they dobbed him in, and that's how Kaczynski actually got arrested by his own brother. Is that irony? I'm not sure. Is it just a coincidence? Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments sections below. Okay, so let's look at the Unabomber's background. Kaczynski was born in Chicago on May 22nd, 1942. So he shares the same birthday with George Best, legendary footballer who struggled with alcohol, and Novak Djokovic, #1 ranked tennis player at the moment, who struggles with gluten, and Naomi Campbell, famous supermodel who struggled with manners. Kaczynski had severe hives as a young boy, which forced him into hospital isolation, so that meant he had limited contact with others, and apparently he showed little emotion as a baby for months. In fact, when he was a child, he showed sympathy for animals in cages more than people or other animals that were helpless, and his own mother speculated that this happened because of his experience of the hospital isolation. So Kaczynski was actually initially a leader amongst his peers, although he was so clever that he skipped 6th grade, and then he didn't fit in with the older children who bullied him, and he was described as aloof even as a child. So Kaczynski earned a master's and a PhD in maths, or for our American viewer, in math, at the University of Michigan, and he joined the mathematics faculty at UC Berkeley, which is pretty prestigious, but inexplicably he resigned 2 years later. As a graduate, he sought treatment for depression and anxiety, and also apparently had some sexual identity confusion issues. From that point onwards, Kaczynski withdrew from the world. He made himself a log cabin in the Montana woods without running water or electricity, and he just sort of got by with very little means apart from money that his family sent him and just doing odd jobs here and there. So now let's look at what happened during his trial, including the psychiatric perspective. and then I'll tell you what I think. So Kaczynski was assessed by numerous forensic psychiatrists and psychologists, and as I said, some of them diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. A renowned forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Dietz said that he wasn't psychotic, didn't have schizophrenia, but instead suffered from schizoid or schizotypal personality disorder. The schizoid personality disorder, it's a bit complex. I don't want to go into it in a lot of detail, although I might do in a future vid. If you want to hear about that, let me know. Briefly, I'll describe it as follows. It's a chronic and pervasive condition, like all personality disorders, and it's characterized by social isolation and a feeling of like indifference towards other people. So people who live with this disorder are often described as distant or withdrawn. They tend to avoid social interactions with other people. So it's quite similar to negative symptoms of schizophrenia, but the difference would be that in schizophrenia, there would typically also be positive symptoms at some point, like delusions or hallucinations. Incidentally, Dr. Dietz has crept up in another one of my videos because he was very instrumental to the evidence of another case, which I've done a video on, and that's the case of Andrea Yates, who suffered from schizophrenia. Go check out that video. So Dr. Dietz gave very poor quality testimony in Andrea Yates' case, which led her to initially being found guilty of murder of her own 5 children, and then she went to prison. But then later this finding was overturned because people found holes in Dr. Dietz's testimony, and then later Yates was sent to hospital instead of prison where she currently is, and in my view, because she's so unwell, that's the correct place for her. So after his arrest, Kaczynski tried to hang himself and he failed, and then later on he was found competent to stand trial, which is kind of the American version of fit to plead. So his own defense lawyers and attorneys tried to enter a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. However, Kaczynski himself refused this and denied that he was mentally ill. What is that all about? So there's a few different scenarios here. One is that he was not unwell, or alternatively he was unwell but he lacked insight. And that's actually very common with people with schizophrenia. They generally believe that the experiences they're having, hearing voices or conspiratorial delusions, they actually believe they're true. So I've helped rehabilitate hundreds of people with schizophrenia. From my experience, when they do gain insight, it's not because they think that their experiences are any less real, but it's because after time has passed, they've realized that other people don't believe them, and therefore that's the way they gain sort of secondary insight. And also other people constantly show them proof that they're false. If you want to know more about that, check out my videos on hearing voices and also my video on delusions, including real life cases I've assessed where these symptoms have led to violence and offending. Obviously, I've anonymized the patients out of respect for patient confidentiality. Anyway, I ask you, what other YouTube videos tells you about their real life patients? Who has the balls to do that? Another perspective about Kaczynski denying he's mentally unwell could be that he was so invested in his ideas, in everything he wrote in his manifesto, that he didn't want his ideas to be discredited by him being diagnosed with a mental illness, regardless of whether he actually believed that he was mentally ill or not. Just as an interesting point, Kaczynski had the longest and most expensive investigation in the history of the FBI up until that point. So he ended up serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole, and he was in a prison in Colorado. Interestingly, in prison he became close friends with the perpetrators of the World Trade Center bombing and also the Oklahoma City bombing. So you got to ask, with friends like those, who needs enemies? So life imprisonment, by the way, means he'll spend the rest of his life in prison, as opposed to other life sentences where a prisoner serves a minimum term known as a tariff and could potentially be released later on when they're deemed that they're safe. But after they're released, they're supervised and observed for the rest of their life, hence life sentence, by probation services. If you're interested to know more about how that all works, then you should check out my video, quite a recent one, on Colin Pitchfork, who is a double child rapist and double child murderer who was released from prison by parole services recently in England, causing, unsurprisingly, a high degree of controversy. Go check it out. Okay, now for the juicy bit, my own personal psychoanalysis of Kaczynski. So I think there's a lot going on here. As I mentioned, he had severe hives as a young boy, which forced him into hospital isolation, which would have limited his contacts with others. And these are the formative years for emotional maturity and for developing bond. So perhaps this lack of human contact was the reason that he apparently showed little emotion for months. As I said, he showed more sympathy for caged animals or otherwise helpless animals. So maybe psychodynamically he related more to a wounded animal than to people because he was treated like one, for good reason, when he was a baby. Kaczynski was so clever that he skipped 6th grade and he didn't fit in with the older children who bullied him, which makes sense to me because if they see somebody who's like younger, who looks who looks weaker and looks more vulnerable, but is also kind of showing them up unintentionally by being more intelligent than them. And then he's stepping into their turf. That makes him an easy target. No wonder he was described as aloof, easen as a child. So to me, we're getting the picture of somebody who's a child and then later as a man who's already been marginalized and pushed away, who's already had the sense of not belonging and being treated as a special case being ill when he's a baby, special case of being this like freak of intelligence as a schoolboy. And then as a graduate, he sought treatment for depression and anxiety. As I said, he had some sexual identity confusion issues. So to me, this all contributes to his identity crisis. It all makes him even more alienated. Now, Kaczynski joins the mathematics facility at UC Berkeley, and then he inexplicably resigned 2 years later. And that's the point where he started withdrawing from the world. He went into the Montana woods, lived without running water or electricity, and he survived off very little means. But why? Why would somebody who's highly qualified and more than capable of finding decent employment, in fact, he even did have decent employment. So why did he do that? So to me, this social decline is in keeping with schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia often isolate and they withdraw. And as I've said in previous videos, they can have positive symptoms, which are extra things like hearing voices or delusions, or they can have negative symptoms, which are when things are taken away, such as energy levels, motivation, withdrawal, wanting to socialize. So people who suffer from these negative symptoms, their lives tend to fall apart. They lose their friends, they lose their jobs, they lose their kind of financial independence, and this is all known as social drift. So if I was to assess Kaczynski in person, I would want to know what his kind of thought pattern behind it all was, why he was isolating himself. Was it because he had this lack of drive and energy, or was it simply because he just didn't like people? The first would indicate potential schizophrenia, the latter wouldn't. Many people that I've assessed on this channel and many perpetrators of serious violence are rejected and marginalized. It's like a common thread. However, I think Kaczynski had a very unique situation because he was exceptionally intelligent. So, on top of his inferiority complex and feeling different, he probably felt that other people weren't intellectually up to his equal and they weren't sort of worthy. So this would have added to a sense of his narcissism. So what I'm saying is, in my view, Kaczynski simultaneously had both an inferiority complex and a superiority complex. So it must have been kind of emotionally exhausting to try and conceptualize this all together. Because let's face it, it's nice to be smart, it's nice to be the smartest person in the room, but if you never find people who can match your level of intelligence, then after a while, that must be quite frustrating, it must be depressing. Just imagine if you were a professor who was a contestant on Love Island, but that's your entire life. Or a bit like me talking to your family at a barbecue. In terms of his manifesto, Kaczynski wrote that technology had a destabilizing effect on society and it made it unfulfilling and it caused widespread psychological suffering. And I have to say, his words sound eerily accurate when you think about cyberbullying and the dissatisfaction for people who are like jealous of watching other people online who seem to have these amazing online profile lives. And also studies have shown that there's a clear correlation between the length spent on social media and feelings of sadness and low mood. And Kaczynski called this all before social media even existed. He said that most people spend their time engaged in useless pursuits because of technological advances. I wonder if he was talking about the trolls that get me on this YouTube channel. Kaczynski was actually trying to fight industrialization when he himself lived in nature and became a recluse. So he himself witnessed firsthand the destruction of the wilderness around him. So actually his thoughts and his beliefs are in keeping with his environment, which suggests that what he's thinking isn't delusional. Kaczynski predicted that further technological advances would lead to extensive genetic engineering and that most human beings would be adjusted to meet the needs of society rather than vice versa. And again, I don't think he's necessarily wrong. I'm thinking about 0-hour contracts here, poor delivery drivers, Amazon warehouse workers. And what is scary is there seems to be a lot of sense in what he's saying. At least some of his beliefs, in my opinion, don't believe to be out of reality or psychotic, although I'm categorically saying that his actions to justify his beliefs were unreasonable. It's also entirely possible that his beliefs about technology were based in reality, but he also had other beliefs that weren't teased out because he wasn't psychiatrically assessed, that he had to kill people to put forward his agenda. When I think about this case, I think of Extinction Rebellion. Like Kaczynski, they both worried about the future of humanity, and they both felt that things needed to stop and that usual political campaigns campaigning and trying to raise awareness doesn't work. Like Kaczynski, Extinction Rebellion feel that their actions need to be extreme to force people to pay attention. Kaczynski was more worried about technology, and Extinction Rebellion was more about environmental damage. Having said that, Kaczynski did have beef with the people that tried to cover up the Exxon oil spillages. Extinction Rebellion are thought more of a nuisance by some people. They're not thought to be mentally ill because their actions aren't quite as extreme. They do things like they block bridges in London, they do protests outside the Houses of Parliament, because, as a wise philosopher once said, ideology in an individual is insanity, ideology in a group is revolutionary. Now, I must admit, I just made that up, but I am a wise philosopher. Kaczynski's manifesto was described as rambling and ranting. In fact, it was so characteristic of him that his own brother recognised it. Now, that in itself is definitely a possible indicator of schizophrenia. It's a lesser known but often unspoken about symptom of schizophrenia named thought disorder, and that's where you jump randomly between topics without a connection between your thoughts. Kind of a bit like a toddler trying to tell you a story, or you at your last job interview. If I had the chance to assess Kaczynski in person, as well as the obvious stuff such as whether he had a family history of psychosis, which would increase the risk of him becoming psychotic, and whether he was having other psychotic symptoms such as hearing voices, I'd also thoroughly question him in detail about the strengths of his beliefs. So for example, what would he think would happen if the world didn't change technological advances? What would happen in the future? Would it be, for example, that people would be more isolated and technology would damage humans' emotions and connections in society, which is probably true and not psychotic? Or, for example, would it be that mankind would die and technology and computers would take over, which would be delusional, unless, of course, you are John Connor. There's no fate except for what we make for ourselves. Hey, do you know? What's wrong with Wolfie? So, was Kaczynski actually psychotic? If you notice, I've been dodging this question more than Floyd Mayweather dodges his punches. Firstly, I point out that Kaczynski is not criminogenic. So he's not somebody that's got a long history of violent offending outside of his bombs. He doesn't get into fights. He doesn't seemingly take perverse pleasure in hurting others. It's all about his ideology. So in my view, there's two possibilities here. Either Kaczynski was preoccupied with his intense beliefs, which, as I've said, the beliefs themselves are not unreasonable, though he was willing to do very extreme, unreasonable things to get attention for his cause, which in itself is not psychosis, not schizophrenia, it's not mental illness. So think of that Vietnamese Buddhist monk who burned himself to death, busy Saigon Road intersection on the 11th of June, 1963, and he was protesting the persecution of Buddhists by the South Vietnamese government. For a bonus point, in the comments, which album cover had a picture of this? Or Kaczynski was actually delusional and he had an incorrect paranoid belief that was not based in reality. For example, that the world would end if he didn't carry out his acts, so he had to do this. As I've said earlier, there are other indications of negative symptoms of schizophrenia and social drift, and as I said, his rambling, potentially thought disordered manifesto. So the evidence is mixed, but if I had to pick a side, I would say yes, I believe on balance that the Unabomber did have schizophrenia. So the next logical and very reasonable question is this: what difference does it make? Before I get to that, I've got questions for you, dear viewers. So do you believe in any of the agendas of either Extinction Rebellion or Kaczynski? And if you do, what is the solution? Are extreme measures ever justified? Okay, let's get back to the main point. Okay, Dr. Das, I've been watching your smarmy face for 20 odd minutes. Please tell us that some of this nonsense actually matters. So ultimately, the distinction between whether Kaczynski was psychotic or not is about the potential to treat him and rehabilitate him. So it goes without saying that what Kaczynski did was extremely dangerous and that he needs to be contained for the safety of society. He needs to be punished for moralistic reasons, obviously, but also as a deterrent for any other budding terrorists. And if there are any of you out there watching this, remember, bombs just ain't cool, man. Okay, so here's the important bit, so pay attention, kids. If his actions were not related to psychosis or delusional behavior, then Kaczynski's probably never going to be rehabilitated. There's no point in sending him to a psychiatric hospital. He should and will stay in prison where he will die. But crucially, if this was related to delusional beliefs from schizophrenia, and if they were treatable with medication and therapy, then potentially he can be rehabilitated. This could have been addressed at trial and he could have been sectioned to a hospital instead of prison. This is the exact kind of thing that I give evidence for as an expert witness in criminal courts. So could he potentially be released? Yes, potentially. So I really stress potentially because it depends on a number of numerous factors. So So if Kaczynski was, for example, resistant to being treated, or even if with our best medications we couldn't really treat schizophrenia effective, so because of the severity of his illness, or if he didn't want to engage in therapy to understand his mindset that led to the attacks, then he'd probably never be released. However, if it was very obvious that his heinous actions were only associated with delusional beliefs, so for example, after therapy, after medication, his whole mindset and opinions completely changed and his whole outlook completely changed, then it's at least feasible that he can be fully rehabilitated. The degree of this rehabilitation would also depend on numerous factors. So that would involve carrying out regular risk assessments, which is done by professional consultant forensic psychiatrists such as yours truly. Kaczynski would almost certainly start in a high secure hospital like Broadmoor, where there's an extra level of observation and a higher proportion of nursing staff, at least in the beginning, due to the very, not so much due to the very dangerous nature of his crimes, but I would say more due to the notoriety and the press attention that they got. So think about it this way: he's not a violent, dangerous man outside of the context of making bombs, so he doesn't have access to making bombs in Broadmoor, so he doesn't need high secure. He also wouldn't have access to making bombs in a medium or low secure unit. He would still be in a locked ward, still be observed. But the reason he needs a high secure unit like Broadmoor would be because of the notoriety. He'd be a target, there'd be a lot of media attention. However, further along the line, if he did get rehabilitated after many years, potentially he could step down to a medium or a low secure unit. So in this kind of environment, he would have less restrictions and he could potentially have leave, like escorted leave, at least in theory. And it's even possible that he could eventually be released. Again, it's ultimately the decision of the consultant forensic psychiatrist in charge. Obviously, after release, he would have to be very closely monitored. He'd probably be given antipsychotic injection medication on a regular basis to make sure he's being medicated. He would also be assessed psychiatrically to look at his mental state regularly, and psychiatrists and psychologists would question his overall thought patterns and beliefs to make sure he doesn't have a return of these hostile, vengeful, hateful, murderous kind of ideas and preoccupations. So that might sound quite extreme that he could be released, but I've certainly seen cases in my career of people who have committed murders who've eventually been rehabilitated and have been released. Although I should say none of them were quite as intense and high profile or attention grabbing as the Unabombers. Again, I want to just really emphasize that if he was to be rehabilitated and released, it would only be if his actions were in the context of mental illness only. So before I conclude this episode, I'm quickly going to introduce you to a channel. This is A Psych for Sore Minds, your one-stop shop for information about mental illness and about criminality, hosted by moi, consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders in courts, prisons, secure psychiatric units. I act as an expert witness for criminal court trials. This channel addresses a whole range of issues, some dealing with criminality, some dealing with more common mental health issues. I interview people, ex-patients. I talk about my old cases, anonymizing the patients for patient confidentiality. I address individual diagnoses. I look at our high-profile true crime cases. What I'm trying to say is basically there's something for everybody on this channel. Go check it out. Spread the love. Tell everybody that you've ever met for the rest of your life about this channel because they deserve it. Also, please subscribe to this channel. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it actually makes your dreams more pleasant, guaranteed. So to conclude, I'm in no way approving of Kaczynski's acts. Hopefully this video will help you understand some of the relevant factors. In summary, I can absolutely see where a certain set of circumstances where a lot of things are aligned, where Kaczynski, if he had schizophrenia, could potentially be rehabilitated and released into society. But to finish, I'm going to leave you guys with a scary thought. If Kaczynski wasn't psychotic, and if he was actually thinking about the bigger picture in the long-term development of humanity, the guy's got an IQ of 170, so he is probably more intelligent than you or I. And we may be only condemning him and imprisoning him, but we might be ignoring his hyper-intelligent predictions of the future. Dun dun dun! Right, subscribe. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it makes your deltoids more bigger and well-refined. Just want to mention that I'm going to be in CrimeCon in September in London. It is a huge convention for true crime enthusiasts. I'm going to be doing a talk there. I'll also be on Podcast Row. Come and meet me in person, discuss my videos. And also there's going to be talks from a whole range of people within the industry, from investigative journalists to reporters to podcast makers to YouTubers to detectives, etc., etc. Until next time, stay euthymic, and please remember, I love you.